Alrighty, welcome back. Today I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the testing situation. I posted, I think, 2 weeks earlier about MIT news and how standardized tests are making a comeback. With that being said, I wanted to go into the nuances, a little bit of the data of what happened over the last 2 years since COVID, where a lot of schools inevitably had to go test optional because of all the cancellations of SATs, et cetera, et cetera. Um, yeah, let's just dive right into it. First and foremost, test optional is not test optional. It's a trap. The source I'm getting all this from is a recent book that I picked up by Jeffrey Selingo. He started off at US News Rankings and was a writer there. And he's been there for many decades now, and at least been in the scene for college admissions. And he's had an inside scoop about all this. So I'm going to be pulling from a little bit of the data that he's extracted over the last 2 years. First and foremost, there's a pandemic policy shift. Majority of universities swapped to test optional over the last 2 years. And as a result of that, there have been two key things that we need to be aware of. Number one, more students are applying to colleges that they otherwise would have hesitated or declined to apply to due to test requirement. Um, a lot of schools prior to the pandemic had this median or middle ground SAT, ACT score that they'd publish or make clear. And that became kind of the metric that, or kind of the bar that you had to reach. When students didn't reach that bar in previous years, pre-pandemic, it was a strong signal for them to not apply. When you remove that barrier, essentially it becomes an open range. And as a result, you have more students applying to schools that they otherwise wouldn't have applied to, and just the general, more students applying overall as a whole as a college. The data then pans out to the following. This has led to a 10% increase in overall application volume and a significant portion of applicant growth in selective colleges. Selective colleges, I would kind of ballpark with like US News ranked top 30s, maybe top 40s. Liberal arts colleges, let's say top 20s, top 30s. A 10% increase in overall application volume. The data that I want to kind of pit that against is then, do the selective colleges have an increase in 10% or more in the total capacity of students they're going to admit and enroll? Short answer, and my insight to that probably is no. And as a result, that's why they're getting smaller and smaller numbers, or acceptance rates are becoming smaller and smaller. I read this crazy stat that when you applied to Johns Hopkins in 1990, your admissions chance was around roughly 50%. If you take a look at Johns Hopkins now, it's depending on whether you play early decision or regular, it's much less than that. It's 10% or less, depending on your major choice, of course. There's all those other factors, but come on, guys. Johns Hopkins, a 50% acceptance rate. If that was the reality today, that would be insane. So the reality is more people are applying, and you have more students applying to a broader range of colleges. So there's an oversaturation of the supply that's happening. There's increased demand, and that demand is becoming less picky. It's spreading itself out. Roughly 50% of applications sent to selected colleges did not include a test score. 50% spread out. So what does that mean? That means, on the one hand, if you're an admission officer, you've got a lot more work to do. And more importantly, because they make the testing optional, it's putting a bit more of an emphasis on other elements of your application. And I have a couple slides we'll be able to go through, but let's just take a look at what this pans out to for certain colleges. So growth of university applications after COVID, or as a result of COVID, Harvard increased by 42%, UCLA by 25%. What I thought was insane about that was the fact that it had 160,000 applicants. I'd argue it's the most popular school in the world. And it kind of makes sense if you've been in this industry, because over the last maybe 7-8 years, UCLA's definitely shown an uptick in marketing and advertising. They're definitely going more into the East Asian markets. You'll see that in China, and they have like marketing campaigns. USC also is the same in this regard. This later on kind of references the ranking system and how schools to a certain degree benefit from over marketing getting more students, even though they know they're not going to be as qualified, still marketing to them and getting them to apply. Because when they apply, you have an increased number of applicants. If you have an increased number of applicants, you become more selective because you have to have a smaller acceptance rate as a whole. And a smaller acceptance rate it gives you the perception of being more prestigious, more selective, and it becomes this like snowball effect. So UCLA has been riding on that high over the last 5, 6, 7 years of just really investing in their branding, in their brand name. And as a result, 160,000 applicants. Holy cow. Emory, 19%. Colgate, this one really just dropped my jaw. But at the same time, it made sense to me, right? So over 100% increase, more than double its number of applicants in the past. I could be wrong, but I got a little dodgy in the memory. But I could swear that Colgate maybe 7, 8 years ago, right, wasn't a top 15 liberal arts college, wasn't even a top 20. I distinctly remember it being like 24, 28, around that range. But again, over the last 5 years, it's really benefited from what I think is the overflow of demand for these Ivy League schools or top 15 selective schools. Think of it as like a big boat, right? The big boat that everyone wants to get on is the selective top 15, top 20 schools. But because those boats are so overcrowded, there's these small little mini boats that are right alongside. Those mini boats being liberal arts colleges, and they're ranked 10 to 25. And so those started to get saturated because of the overflow of demand on the selective side. So Colgate, I think, was exactly one of those things. It's like a lifeboat on the side of the big competitive boat. And because there were so many students applying, Colgate just kind of got all the overflow of that. And as a result, you see over double the number of applicants to that school. And then you look at its rankings today. And then it makes a lot of sense because Colgate now, I think, is in the rank 10s to 20s. It's considered a very competitive liberal arts schools in the tier 2 category by my eyes. Penn State, 11% increase. I mentioned that, included that in there because there's no safe haven for this. Even the competitive top 50 universities, whether it's state, public, private, all of them, if you're ranked within the 50 or up, you are benefiting from this wave of increased applicants. And to my understanding, something that's going to continue to become like there's not going to be, in my opinion, a slowdown in the number of applicants. I think it's just going to only continue to grow. Increasing application numbers effects. So what does this mean? We understand that more students are applying to a wider ranges and more students as a whole are applying. Sometimes to the degree where it's just really pumping up the numbers of these liberal arts colleges and making them more selective and competitive. So by opening the applicant pool to a wider range of academic levels, colleges now contend the following. Number one, dynamic of popularity, number of applicants to school rankings. Okay, so what I mean by this is there is a race in terms of rankings right now. Whether you agree with the ranks or not, or how it's calculated, one of the elements is how popular school is. In other words, how many students apply to your school. And then from there, it's the acceptance rate. I mentioned this like a couple minutes earlier, but that becomes one of the leading factors that is going to have an influence in this, like I mentioned, snowballing potential effect. If a school becomes more popular, it's going to rise in rank. If it rises in rank, it's going to be more appealing to parents and students. And then it just continues that trend. Number two, the emphasis is more on rigor of high school courses and grades. So I have a couple of subpoints to this. Your GPA is associated to your high school. Okay. Not everyone's GPA, not all GPAs are created equal. If you're getting a 4.0 from a socioeconomically lower tier like neighborhood that maybe struggles with poverty or gang violence, your GPA is going to be vastly different. It's going to be evaluated differently than if you go to a super uppity prep, socioeconomically higher social strata class location, whether it's like in Irvine, Orange County, or let's say like Upland, San Francisco areas. Your GPA, as a result, is going to be one of the main academic signals that will be taking the brunt or taking the additional burden of what otherwise would have been your standardized exams. If you don't have standardized exams, basically you're shifting the weight of that decision, the weight of that onto your grades. As a result, where and how you get your grades will matter. Okay, So in other words, there's going to be little room for error. If you don't send a test score, your GPA is going to have that much more scrutiny over it. When you have a GPA, let's say, okay, so let me rephrase this. I recently was talking with a lot of students because a lot of my juniors want to go towards, they're planning for senior year courses. And I also have a couple of underclassmen, let's say like freshman, sophomore. And a very common thing I've been running into from some of my students is, Jay, can I not do AP Lang or AP Lit for senior year? I just heard that the teacher's like a demon and really hard. And I know I can get A's. I'll just drop if I do regular. Okay. If you are encroaching upon that type of thought, I understand why students would. Okay. It becomes kind of a question of, is it better to get an A in a regular class, or is it better to get a B in an AP class? I want to be very blunt about this. What I'm trying to say is that at this point, especially with test optional schools, if you choose not to submit a test and you are already thinking of taking a notch down on your academic rigor in your high school, particularly your junior year or senior year, I'm going to be blunt about it. I think that's a genuine point of just saying maybe you shouldn't be aiming for these higher schools. Because these higher schools, they expect this to be the default, that you're taking more and more rigorous courses and you're excelling in them. Granted, there's some nuance there. Let's say, Jay, I know that it's going to be a signal that shows that I'm a little weaker in the rigor, but I'll get the A in the normal classes, the non-competitive classes, and I'll just make up for it with strong activities. There's a certain degree of allowance there, okay? But if you have a son or daughter, or if you're a student right now and you're thinking, if you're tempted by the idea that I want to take one less AP than the standard norm of a competitive student from your high school, then you should be asking, like, do I really have what it takes? Am I really at the aptitude level to be applying to these higher tier schools? Does that come off as being a little too mean? I'm not sure. But I guess I'll say it in a much simpler form. If you're a student and you come to me and you say, I want to take a less competitive senior year course workload, then in my eyes, I'm thinking, okay, that then lowered the ceiling, right? The upper threshold, the reach level of what schools you should be considering. 93% of test optional applicants to Georgia Tech took calculus in high school. Why did I put that note in there? For the schools that don't have, or let's say you're a student that doesn't have, who intends to take advantage of the test optional and not submit a test score, that doesn't put you off the hook. It just puts more emphasis on your academics and the rigor of your academics. Case in point, Georgia Tech, right? If you are a test optional applicant, you better have at least calculus, like calculus AB ideally, but that would be on the lower end, to be honest, depending on the school you go to. But let's say you're taking calculus AB junior year and calculus BC senior year, right? About 93% of test optional applicants had that. So if you are a student who decides not to submit a test score and also shows a weaker level of high school math, you're going to be in the bottom 7 percentile of students, and that doesn't bode well for your chances. So at the very least, if your test score if you're going to opt out of submitting a test score, your grades better be stronger. The difficulty of your courses better be higher. Number 3, allowance for admissions to weigh more heavily their institutional priorities. So this is something that goes more towards the macro or the meta of college admissions. Because one of the reasons why an admissions committee celebrates the reduction or the removal of tests, the requirement of tests, is that historically speaking, tests are correlated to your socioeconomic status. The richer you are, your parents are, the richer neighborhood you're in, the higher your test scores are. And if you are a college that is trying to create a certain type of priority, a certain type of agenda of equality, of diversity, then you're celebrating right now that you've reduced the test score in that regard. Because now you can choose students from socioeconomically lower tiers, create and in doing so, invite more based on your institutional priorities, such as choosing from more ethnically diverse pools, choosing from first-generation college students, you have more of a reason to do that. Or maybe a better way of phrasing it is, you no longer have that test score expectation really kind of forcing you to not consider students that maybe come from these other taglines. As a result, I think when you are looking at students' results this year, like their admissions result this year, I think this has been the season where I've seen the greatest amount of inconsistencies, non-correlations. So a typical, for example, a parent will correlate, if I got into a rank 30, 40, 50 school like UC Irvine, then for sure I should be getting into a rank 50, 60, 70 school like UC or Riverside or Santa Cruz. They assume that the rankings correlate to your admission chances. But the truth is, this year I've seen more examples of the opposite, where a student will get accepted to Stanford, but then they get rejected from UC Riverside and UC Irvine, right? There's an element of being overqualified. That could be obviously a point of explanation. Colleges are going to be more selective in the sense that they want to retain. They get, there's a metric that evaluates whether they, of all the students they gave acceptances to, how many choose to enroll in that school, right? There's literally mathematical models, machine learning models that go through the data to identify that percentage, that proportion. And that often can have an impact on your decision. So I remember saying to a student, explaining this to a student and parent and saying, there's no longer really a lot of safety schools, because the safety schools, because they're looking out for their own metrics, may realize like you wouldn't even want to come to our school, so let's just reject you and give an acceptance to someone who has a higher probability that they would accept the result or would accept your acceptance and attend your school. There's a lot of this like very choppy admission results going on. Why am I mentioning at this point institutional priorities? I've seen a lot of students that simply showcase that they were first-generation college students, and they'd have a noticeably lower GPA or their test scores would be lower. But maybe then they didn't submit, they went test optional, and as a result, they got accepted, while super qualified students in the same high school that, you know, people would say clearly had a better chance, clearly should have gotten in over the other student, didn't. There's a lot of strategizing now of whether you want to submit an optional score or not based on these certain kinds of tags. But for the majority of my students, we're aiming for more competitive schools, and as a result, here's what we need to know. What is the difference of acceptance rates, whether you send a score or not? Well, they're laid out here. The sample size is, albeit not that big, but I think I covered a range of schools, types of schools. Emory, private school, Atlanta, Georgia, with tests is 17%, without 8.6. I consider it a tier 2, so it's pretty equivalent to maybe UCLA, UC Berkeley, Carnegie Mellon, College of William and Mary, that area. You then have Georgia Tech. With tests, you had a 22% acceptance rate. Without, you had a 10% acceptance rate. And then lastly, Colgate, liberal arts even. With a test score, you had a 25% acceptance rate. Without, you had a 12%. There's a lot of noise in that data. For example, you probably can assume to a certain extent that those who submitted without a test score knew that their scores weren't good. And you can assume if their scores aren't good, their probably grades and test scores and their application as a whole is not that good, right? So maybe that's the explanation. But when you're taking the statistics pound for pound, obviously, I think it's very clear if you take a test for a majority of these schools and you get a competitive score, it's going to be a strong positive signal in your favor, to the point where it's almost double the chances of you getting in. Vanderbilt on the bottom right here is a great exception to that. And there are exceptions, but they're rare. Vanderbilt is one of the few that are rare. With tests, you had a 7.2% chance of getting accepted. Without submitting a score, you had about a 6%. So there's not much of a variance there, but nonetheless, the favor still slightly leans towards those who submit tests. Another thing I ran across in the data is how much your major matters. As a whole, acceptances to more competitive majors like business or engineering was 10% higher for students who submitted test scores. In competitive applicant pools, the more positive signals you can send to admission readers, the better. Test scores are one of the strongest signal sources a student can offer, especially in times where tests are optional. I just want you guys to think about the common rule. You want to go above and beyond, right? Especially in a competitive environment. So if you see something as optional, right? An optional essay to write is another form of this. When you're running into the applications as a rising senior, you're looking at the essays. Oh, there's an optional essay. Oh, it's optional. I don't need to do it. That's the wrong attitude to have if you're trying to be competitive. If it's optional and you're competitive, you want to immediately translate that into your mind as mandatory and do well in it, because that's the way you separate yourself from other students. Another note I put, if you didn't send a score, the admissions will assume that your result was subpar. So I had a specific instance where we were talking about, I think it was like an AP score. We got a 3. And then the parents asked the question along with the student, when we get to the college applications, would it be better if we just hid the AP score of a 3? And my answer to that, I think, is based on this note here. The admissions, if you do that, the admissions will assume that your score was subpar at best. At best, you passed with a 3. At worst, you got a 2 or a 1 and you didn't pass. So in those scenarios, I've made the argument it's better for you to send a score, even if it's subpar, because the best that'll happen if you don't send one is they'll assume the worst too. Final thoughts I want to make about this. Some schools are beginning to revert back to the test required admission policies, i.e. MIT. Again, I mentioned how I uploaded a video about that 2 weeks ago, citing the need to better quantify the academic potential of students and their likelihood to succeed in their university courses. If you're majoring in a competitive or popular major, a good score is almost imperative for you to really stand out in a selection process. So if you have a major choice right now, that's business, engineering, computer science, you should really be considering investing more of your time into grinding out a good score, even if it's optional. Take the most difficult classes you can and do well in it at your high school. Again, I spent a lot of time on this in an earlier part of this video, but if you're a student who's aiming for Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, and we're having a discussion of, hey, maybe I should drop APs, maybe one AP, because I heard the teacher was super hard. There's all these like notions. I kind of categorize them under small excuses. Whether they're valid or not, they're still excuse thoughts or fear thoughts. But if you are aiming for Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale, and you have that as a discussion point, I'm going to be honest with you and say, I don't think you're a Harvard, Stanford, Princeton, Yale student. Your goal, if you're aiming for selective colleges, is to take the hardest classes you can and excel in them. If you're not doing that, you're limiting the ceiling of your chances. Start studying ACT, SAT as a freshman or sophomore. Even if the testing policies or tests themselves change, starting early on developing the core skills involved in those tests, i.e. critical reading, problem solving, time management, etc., are going to be useful in the long run. All right. If you're scoring a 1300 right now on your SAT or a 1200 right now on your SAT, again, I'm not passing judgment on you in terms of what you're capable of or what your potential is in the rest of your life. But a 1200 or a 1300 score, if you're currently a junior, that tells me a strong signal that you're not ready for tier 1, tier 2 level difficulty, like academics at a university. You're a tier 3, tier 4 student. Okay. That doesn't mean you're going to graduate and stay that way the rest of your life. I've seen a lot of tier 3, tier 4 realize that, oh, my 1300 is not about my innate aptitude or intellect. It's how much time I spent practicing a standardized test, right? And how much I committed to developing those core academic skills in that relation. The sooner you start, the better. I feel like even if they get rid of the exams altogether, 2-3 years from now, all colleges got rid of it. The things that SAT prep will teach you are going to be valuable to you no matter what. Lastly, if you're a junior, consider your academic profile and honestly assess whether you need the extra positive academic signal that a test score, a good test score and great test score can give, that universities will value. And determine your time investment to realistically go for a strong or stronger score alongside all of your summer activities and college applications, essays, preparations. If you're a junior right now and your academic profile is kind of borderline, you have one more thing you can do to help alleviate that, to send a strong academic positive signal. And that is to take an SAT or ACT, score well competitively above the middle average, right, the median score, and send it. to especially those test optional applications, universities. If you're curious about what the medians are, one of the couple of first videos I posted up here was the Research University and Liberal Arts University tier list. Just check my videos. I have if you look at the video description, I posted a link to the spreadsheet that showcases all the updated median scores for SAT. But yeah, I just wanted to make this very clear. I've been running into, in my own work with students, issues with where I'm getting a lot of like those requests. Hey Jay, do you mind if I drop one of my core APs? Core AP being in either English, history, science, or math. And then on top of that, they're not committing, or they're hesitating to pursue standardized test scores, studying for the SAT, ACT, one last go over the summer if you're a junior, because they see this test optional thing, right? So basically the school situation, the college application situation has made it so that there's a lot of ways where you can cut corners. But if you cut those corners, you're going to get burned if you're aiming for a higher school. Yeah, I hope that this was helpful. Stay tuned for the next week. I think I want to continue to go into all the data that's been collected by this guy. And yeah, I think that's it.